I know that people like the whole idea of we need the political savior to come save us. Let's get the right guy in the White House. What a mess our whole country is. We need to get the right guy in the White House. The guy in the White House is always a front for the bankers, and it's pretty much always been that way. The CIA itself, it's the bankers. If you look at the early CIA, it was all bankers. It was Wall Street lawyers out of Sullivan and Cromwell. That's who's been doing this the whole time. And now they're enslaving the planet with spy satellites. And they're the spies, So, I don't know. I just get so tired of the election rhetoric sometimes. People just really need to understand that this is the bankers. They run the public sector. They run the private sector. This is a financial slavery system. It's the slavery system they've been using for decades, but on steroids. And in Latin America, their big focus is to integrate Argentina and Brazil. They want to do the same thing to South America that they did to Europe to create the European Union, which is start with a free trade agreement for all of Europe. That's how the EU started. It evolves into this bureaucratic totalitarian behemoth, and it's yoked to the US through the Eurodollar. They're doing the same thing in Latin America. There's all these different iterations of it, right-leaning and left-leaning, which are basically all globalist governance, attempts to integrate South America at the regional level. There's PROSUR, there's Mercosur, there's UNASUR, there's ALADI, there's all these different acronyms. There's the Organization of American States. The goal of all of these, one way or another, is to regionally integrate, whether it's under right-leaning dialectics or left-leaning dialectics. That's what they want. And they want a free trade of the Americas, so not just NAFTA. That was the North American one, right? They want one for all of the Americas. They want to regionally integrate all of the Americas at the economic level, lead it down this path towards bureaucratic regional governance to be part of this global governance patchwork thing, which has been, the push for arguably a very, 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 very long time. And they want to do it with spy satellites and all this other stuff going on. But the idea is to do that same model used in the EU, but they want to yoke it with dollar stable coins, not the euro dollar necessarily. And so the Argentina, Brazil and Argentina are the ones they need to have most under their thumb because they're the biggest countries in size of South America. You get Brazil and Argentina, you basically get the whole continent. So my concern is you're going to have them try and do it the right-leaning way through people like Javier Milei, and if they get him back in power, Bolsonaro, and frame them as, they're defeating the baddies, but really they're just, they're the other hand, like we discussed earlier. And what's interesting too is a lot of this group that's discussed in the Green Plus piece, RSK, the satellite firm, and some of the connective tissue between them that includes, Zappa, Wences Casares, and these figures are essentially like the Argentinian branch of the PayPal mafia. A lot of their companies were funded and directed by this entity that Mark mentioned earlier called Endeavor, which is chaired right now by Edgar Bronfman Jr., who, if you've read my book, you'll know a lot about the Bronfmans and organized crime and political power. They're, for example, the family that essentially bankrolled Justin Trudeau in Canada, among other figures. And they're very powerful. Reid Hoffman of the PayPal Mafia and LinkedIn and whatnot, also a very close Epstein pal, is also very intimately tied up with Endeavor. And the companies that Endeavor helped create are some of the biggest companies in Latin America now. Many of them are based in Argentina. The biggest one, of course, is based in Argentina. The first Endeavor success story, which would be Mercado Libre, which is Marcos Galperin, who, as Mark mentioned earlier, he's on the board of Satellogic, involved with a lot of these other companies. Mercado Libre itself is very much interfaced with Paxos, PayPal, and groups like that. And it's sort of like what happened earlier, what I mentioned earlier about those figures sort of king-making the corporate titans of Latin America. So this is like a modern iteration of that with like the same players. They're funding these startups and ensuring which companies get big and if they succeed, but they're, Endeavor's not an Argentinian entity. It's an entity run by people like Edgar Bronfman and Reid Hoffman. And so there's an Endeavor Argentina branch, and pretty much all of these companies that we discuss in the piece that are based in Argentina are part of this Endeavor Argentina network. And Argentina is where I would argue, are going to test out a lot of these efforts, most likely under Milei, because he's very amenable to these kinds of policies. And so one of these figures that, that comes up a lot in the piece, this Diego Gutierrez, he's one of the co-founders of RSK, of Rootstock. He gave this very revealing interview about a year ago, and he was talking about several things that I think are important to bring up in the context of this interview. One of them is that as Bitcoin becomes integrated into Wall Street, Bitcoin has to shed its ethos as he called it. Essentially, it has to stop being a tool of dissent, a threat to both commercial and central banks, and essentially become their tool. That's what he says. So for Bitcoin to succeed, in his eyes, that has to happen. So that's very telling. And then he also says that there's going to be a concerted push to move away from money printed by the state, meaning central banks, and instead move to commodity-backed stablecoins where the people that own the commodities will have all the power. I think that's very interesting. Because obviously Milei, in his case, right, came to power framing himself as very libertarian, but his policies thus far have shown him to be very crony capitalist, in my opinion. We've talked about this before, and Mark brought up some stuff, to that point, but keep in mind too that, a lot of the people in his government are from JP Morgan, for example, or the Argentinian branch of major Wall Street banks. He's been very closey with people like Fink and Musk, as discussed, among others, and very friendly with like Zelensky and the Ukraine stuff. I mean, this is not a very libertarian guy under other metrics, and there's been a lot of antagonism with him and Argentina's central bank, which of course is responsible for a lot of bad stuff that has happened in Argentina. But people also need to remember the history of how Argentina got here, which as a lot of this fiscal trouble for Argentina began when it was run by a US and CIA-backed military coup, then under Carlos Menem, who was the great, I say this great not in the actually like, oh, that was great sense, like big, I guess, the big neoliberal in Argentina, recent political history, who was basically just like a goon for, US, foreign interests really to like gobble up Argentinian resources. Milei is a big fan of Menem, and some of the people that are in his government started their political careers under Menem, like Patricia Bullrich, the interior minister, for example. So, you could really frame Milei as a continuation of that stuff, because Mauricio Macri, a lot of people in Milei's government are from the Macri government, especially his economics team. There's a direct line to all of that. And so I am very concerned that, that would be celebrated as like a big, yes, he's gonna, the central bank's not gonna print the peso anymore. It's over, and he's saved Argentina. Well, is it really saving Argentina if he's, going to make, they're gonna use dollar-pegged stable coins. They're regulating the credit of Bitcoin right now, and they're gonna move to this whole model of commodity-backed stable coins, which is already actually happening in Argentina. A company backed by Visa that's based in Argentina is tokenizing basically all of the country's grain deposits to use that as currency. So whoever owns all of the grains, and the biggest landowner is a big former backer of Mauricio Macri, part of Endeavor Argentina. His name is Eduardo Elstein. He owns all of the commodities. He's also a big shareholder of some of Israel's biggest companies. He's going to be the guy that basically controls the money then, right? At least with the grain-backed stable coins. So if you have all these oligarchs in charge of different industries, which is essentially what Argentina has been becoming and has been happening really everywhere around the world, who's going to be in charge of the money? Is that really better than the central bank having it? Because remember, the central bank's run by the commercial banks. So you're just getting, the same shit under a different, name, basically. I don't know. There's a lot of different stuff going on here, and it's going to be interesting to see how it develops. But the other side of this is what's happening in places like Argentina right now, where people have lost so much of their purchasing power. So like before Milei came to power, I think the poverty rate was just, it was insanely high. I think it was something like 60%. And then Milei came into power and devalued the currency by 50%, which led to a massive loss in purchasing power for Argentinians on top of that. Now Argentinians are so desperate and are being told that they're undergoing quote unquote shock therapy designed by a JP Morgan guy, that they're doing WorldCoin. They're scanning their eyes in the Sam Altman orb for shit coins and a cattle tag, a digital ID. And the idea is to have that be like your access to the internet, and using, these tokens and these stable coins, using Tether, using USDC, whatever supported by Mercado Libre's giant entity, Mercado Pago, which is also integrated with Brazil's biggest crypto exchange, Mercado Bitcoin, and then there's Ripio in the mix, which is partnered with all of these guys too. They're going to control all the rails that stuff runs on. And that's where people are running because their money has been so devalued and they have no alternative. And I think that's ultimately the goal, is to get people on programmable, surveillable money by any means necessary. So if you won't do it because you're like, oh yeah, this is a way, I'm going to use JP Morgan coin and beat the Fed CBDC. If you're not going to get suckered into that, then, it seems like they'll use destabilization and desperation as a way to get people to onboard into the systems that they're creating. They're not just going to spend billions of dollars creating these systems and have no one use them. They're going to try and use either, desperation created by public sector policies or by private sector policies, and then have, sort of like 2008. Oh, look, the private banks have destroyed the economy. Now we need the public sector to come in and rein them in, even though Obama's cabinet that was supposed to be doing that was literally chosen by Citigroup. Right? They're the ones that are going to come in and they're going to rein these in, and these are the policies and changes that need to be made. But actually, it's the bankers that wrote the changes that need to be made. Right? So we're likely going to get set up for something like that, where they're going to try and make like existing money worthless. And if you want your money to be worth anything and maintain any sort of semblance of purchasing power, you have to use financial products X, Y, and Z. And they're all going to be programmable and surveillable, if not by the private sector, by the public sector. And they're all going to be interoperable. They're going to be all these different wallets and digital ID systems that look like they're different companies, but they're all the same, essentially, in terms that they can export all their data to the same central global database. And, that's essentially the goal here. So how do we fight against that? Don't use the database, don't use the digital wallet, don't use the digital ID, don't interact with the system. And I think also, I think Bitcoin is obviously very key to their plans, but they need Bitcoin to stay, as Larry Fink said, a technology for asset storage. They refuse to have it be a currency. And actually, Jeffrey Epstein gave an interview about Bitcoin that I didn't know about until maybe a couple months ago when we started researching this. Yep. Oh, yes. No and idea. He says the exact same thing Larry Fink says. It's not a currency. It's, a technology for asset. Basically, if Bitcoin is kept in that box that people like Larry Fink and Jeffrey Epstein and people like them, Larry Summers, presumably, who was on the Zappo advisory board, these guys want Bitcoin to be a specific thing because they can use it. And there's people in the space, like this RSK guy, saying Bitcoin needs to lose its revolutionary ethos. It's got to drop that and become a tool for Wall Street. I think it's pretty obvious what needs to be done to scuttle those plans, which would be ensure the opposite.
Yes.
Yes?
Yes. Use open source software.
So people need to be putting resources into making that happen. And by
trying my best here, Whitney.
The fact
trying
that,
my best.
Well, sure. But basically to recap on that, if they need the Bitcoin blockchain for asset storage, and presumably if we're right about what's going on in this article, which we seem to be, carbon markets, they need that blockchain. How do we invert their plans and use the Bitcoin blockchain so that it's the tool of financial freedom it was heralded to be, because they can't get rid of it without scuttling their own plans.
No.
Right? So how do we...
Bitcoin is money. It's not digital property.
Use it.
It is digital property, but it is money. And it's hard within Bitcoin. There's a lot of hero worship these days. A lot of people getting a lot of pushback.
Yeah, it's not just Bitcoin. I mean, it's everywhere. Yeah. And pretty much most of the heroes are bitches for bankers, whether it's in Bitcoin or in politics. I'm sorry. Well, I think it's important to say, too, that I think there's a lot of people in the Bitcoin media space that will never talk about this or what you just mentioned. And I think a lot of that is because a lot of money and effort has been put into specifically homogenizing media discourse in the Bitcoin space, because they want Bitcoiners as much as possible to be compliant, while Larry Fink and his ilk do what they want with Bitcoin and make it what they want it to be, so that people are content with number go up and sort of the Saylor-esque talking points that have gotten a lot of people have heard those versus what you just mentioned from example. There needs to be a cultural shift in Bitcoin in the opposite direction of what this Diego guy from Rootstock said, where he's like, we need to drop the whole stop fiscal irresponsibility of the banks and central banks and, be a challenge and threat to their power. We have to drop that if we want to get rich. I mean, that's the mentality there. And I feel like the Saylor mentality really isn't that different from that. We have to push people in the other direction, because if we go in the direction they're pushing those, people to go in, people that want to drop the ethos or whatever and make Bitcoin just a tool for Wall Street. I mean, no. If we let that happen, very bad things happen. And there has to be a fight. And there's a specific effort that's been launched against people that hold Bitcoin to try and get them to be compliant in that sense. And that's through, controlling the discourse in the media space. There needs to be a desire among Bitcoiners to return to the original ethos, not the opposite. There needs to be a fight for that. People need to care about that again.